Scripture reading this morning is taken from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? And here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. He replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then he became angry and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. Rejoice.' But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." Here ends the lesson. Holy wisdom, holy words. Thanks be to God.
Hello. Good morning, or afternoon, I don't know what time it is, but hello. It's still morning, right? Yeah. And hopefully we'll leave and it's still morning. I did this last service and it went well, so hopefully, just want to give you guys permission to laugh, to think, and hopefully the words I share with you, God uses to speak to your lives. How many, by show of hands, was this the first time you ever heard this parable? Look around. Not a single hand up. We're very familiar with this parable. The prodigal son. We've heard it 1,000,000 times, maybe some of us 2,000,000. But since our childhood, this is one of the stories that is told over and over again. And we know it. You know, God is willing to forgive us in whatever state that we're in. Wherever we find ourselves, God still loves us enough to forgive us. Amen? All right, we'll see you guys next week. Thanks for coming. right? As we know, parables are the way that Jesus teaches. And most of the time, a parable is supposed to be an illustration or a story, and then the author gives us the meaning. And I joked around saying I got dibs on the parable of the sower and the seed because that's one of the few that has an interpretation. Again, we find ourselves with a parable without an interpretation. So in this story, I'm going to introduce you to a few different people. I'm going to talk about them, and that way you guys can connect to their faces as I share their impact on this sermon. You guys ever know this guy here? Dr. Greg Carey, professor of New Testament at Lancaster Seminary. He has a little booklet that he uses on Luke, and he talks about these parables. And it was actually his quote that I just used, that the parables are used to teach. So he says that Jesus uses parables in his ministry. Over 40 of them occur in the Gospels, but he did so in a distinctive way. In ancient rhetoric, a parable was a story or image designed to compare one thing to another and then explain the comparison. Jesus will tell a story or describe a situation and then let his audience reflect on its significance. In the Gospels, only rarely does Jesus explain a parable. Here we are, the parable of the prodigal son. So, Amy Jo Levine, she is a professor at Vanderbilt School of Divinity, New Testament, a lot of work with the parables, with the Gospels, and she's Jewish. How does that make sense? But given her context, of course she's going to know Jesus' background way better than we do. She lives it. She lives like Jesus. But her take on this story gives it a different view. She says that parables share similarities, especially in this section because it's the three parables of the lost items, right? You have the lost sheep, which we spoke about last week, the lost coin, which we are going to skip, and then the prodigal son. And that's the pattern. She says that there's a very distinct pattern with these three stories. Something is lost. There's a tension and anxiety over this lost item. Then it's found, and then there's always a party. I mean, let's celebrate for finding lost money, right? But she also describes the differences of this last one. Instead of one item, there are two sons. One son leaves on his own, and then he returns. And then there's a celebration. But the parable continues. And here's another tension that is presented with the second son. So in the story, we have the young son, right? Why is it always the young ones? Any parents here? The young ones seem to always be the wild child. And he decides he's a grown man. And he wants to go explore the world, see what the world has to offer. And selfishly, he asks for his part of the inheritance. To our culture today, that's almost like asking the parent to die, because that's the only time you can receive an inheritance, upon someone's death. But Amy Jo says that that was a common practice in the day, because the younger son would get so little that the father said, hey, go try to make something of yourself before I die, so that way you don't have to wait until my death for you to begin your life. So kind of a cushion in a way. So this wasn't really a foreign practice, she says. But he does. He takes his half or his portion, he liquidates it, hits the road, and he finds himself in a foreign land, living his best life. And then he spends all his money. It's like the kid in the candy shop, right? Don't spend all your money in one place. But he does. And not only does he not have any money, now there's a famine in the land. He gets so desperate. What do people without money do? Actually, what do people without money, what should they do? Get jobs, right? Yes. There is no government to take care of them back then. So he went out and he got a job because he was able to. And here, Amy Joshi points out that in this moment of desperation, he wasn't worried about the laws of cleanliness or being unclean or ceremonially unclean. He just worries about the present. What does he need to do at that time? And he goes and gets whatever job's available. And it happens to be feeding pigs. Then the curious part about the story is that he starts eating the pig's food. Have any of us ever been that hungry? I don't know what a pig eats, but I can't imagine it's not like steak and potatoes. They're probably not eating any of that stuff. But imagine being that hungry that you are willing to eat what the pigs are eating. And then at this low moment in his life, he remembers who he is. He had forgotten. He had his comfort of his money. But in some weird way, he doesn't remember who he really is. He remembers where he came from. He remembers his father's house. He remembers his servants. And he thinks they had more than enough. And here I am eating pig food. Maybe I should go back to my father's house and become a servant. And I'm like, hey, you're the son of your father. You're not a servant. But he forgets who he is. He forgets his identity. And he prepares a glorious speech, right? Any of us ever been in trouble and we try to talk our way? What could I say to lessen the blow? And he practices this speech and eloquently, calls on God of heaven and earth. Jesus, Mary, Paul, all 12 apostles, the angels, the shepherds, the donkey in the manger, call on everybody because we need their support. But he prepares this speech in expectation. He says, this is what I have to do, this is what I have to say, but I need to find a way to get back into the house. I need to at least be a servant. I know that's my father, but I need to at least be a servant because they have food. He gets up and he goes. I hope he told his boss he was quitting because then the pigs would have just been left out there. But on his way, the father sees him off in the distance. And the father doesn't wait for him to get home. The father runs to him before he gets home. This extraordinary compassion was seen in the parable of the Good Samaritan. To go out of your own way to help someone. And I don't know if he was foolish or brave or just probably didn't know any better, he begins his speech. Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. Let me be one of your servants. And the father at that moment realizes, my son is in trouble. Not that he came back poor, not that he came back without shoes, but my son forgot who he is. My son forgot his identity. My son doesn't know that he's still my son. And in a biblical moment, he says, go get the robe, go get the ring. Remind them what his identity is. And we see that in Jesus' life. Upon his baptism, he has not done anything, no recorded miracles, nothing happens. He's baptized, the Holy Spirit descends like a dove. And God says from heaven, this is my son. I'm proud of him. I value him. He has worth. And to me, he hasn't done anything yet. But God gives him value, gives him the identity. Jesus, at this moment, God is declaring him the Son of God. So here we have this lost and prodigal son. The word actually prodigal, a lot of people think it means the guy who goes and comes back. But it actually means wasteful. Somebody who doesn't have a care and just spends. So technically, I think the father was the wasteful one by giving this son all the money. And earlier I thought, where was the mom? If there was a woman in that house, this would not have happened. But The father recklessly gives this young son a ton of money. He goes and does his life. But upon his return, the father bestows his identity on him again. You are my son. Here is the coat. We think back to this Joseph story. Here is a ring. Let's have a party. Bring out the fattened calf. And they celebrate, right? End the story. Everybody goes home. They live happily ever after. Oh, wait, Jesus doesn't do things normally. Why, Jesus? Why? There's a second part to this parable. The second son, right? And we find him off in the field working, probably all day under the sun. And he's forgotten. Nobody tells him what happened. Nobody tells him his brother's returned. Nobody invites him to the party. He just happens to come home and people are celebrating. And he finds himself on the outside. So much so that even a servant knows what's happening before him. And the servant tells him, hey, this is going on. Your brother came back. Your brother has returned. Your brother is among us. And your father is doing all this for him. This party is for your brother. And the brother, always a brother, right? He's sitting outside the house, stubborn, angry. We have a contradiction, right? The son who's done everything right, who's never left, who's never asked for anything, and the son who's gone off and spent everything to his name. This is my other friend. I met him when I was 12 years old when I read his book, The Parables of Jesus. His name is Arlen Holtgreen. He's a teacher at Luther Seminary in Minneapolis. I've never met him in real life, but his words through that book impacted me so much that I can definitely look back and say, hey, this was a moment when I realized I wanted to do this for the rest of my life. I wanted to research. I wanted to study. I wanted to know. So I call him my friend. He doesn't know who I am. But his conclusion and his commentary brings such life to this whole parable. Here, Holtgreen ties the parable to the narrative. The son who had been perishing in a far-off country, as good as dead, to a father who had been abandoned by him, can now be called alive again. Here, the language of lost and found on the lips of the father links the parable to the exclamations of the shepherd and the woman in the parables preceding it. I wish I could say that the parable ended great, all was restored, all was made well, and they all lived happily ever after again. But the story doesn't have a conclusion. When I get to heaven, I'm going to tell Jesus, what happened to the story? He must have skipped English composition because this story is missing the ending, right? This story is missing the conclusion. He's a bad writer, Jesus. But what happens next? Do they reconcile? Or do the brothers begin a feud for generations and they never speak to each other again? This is an all too common story within family dynamics. Families live broken because of errors or hurts, and they live in this circumstance for years. We have the younger brother who went out and carelessly lived his life without any regards to those that it affected. But life catches up to him. And it caught up to him fast. And he had to make a decision to save his own life. And at this rock bottom place, he knew and remembered the place where he belonged. Although he didn't remember who he was, He remembered the safety of this place that brought him security, a place called home. And then, on the other hand, is the older brother doing his job, doing the right thing, being a good son, working hard. He was never in need, but he was unable to take his eyes off his want, a young goat to celebrate with his friends, to realize the value of his brother returning well. Sadly, this dynamic plays out in church communities. And earlier I said it was the church across the street or down the street. It doesn't happen here, not this church. But other churches it happens in. That's what I've been told. And if you know me, I know absolutely nothing about the church or the church history or the church dynamics. I gave a brief synopsis. You guys used to be 2 churches, now you're 1 church. And I don't know, that happened like 100 years ago or something. So that's all I know. That's pretty much it. So maybe, was it 100? How long? 25, 50? 44. Okay, I was guessing. And some of you may have been part of that merger. Some of you may have seen the messiness of 2 families coming together and how awkward and weird and meshing and the mess that creates. But here you are. You've made it through. And then the sad thing is that there still are those older brothers that are standing outside our door because of personal hurts or personal vendettas or offenses. They've refused to come into this party. They still hold grudges, and they're missing out of all the fun things happening on the inside. The thing is that they don't realize who they are. They don't realize that they've been invited to the party. They don't realize that this is also their house. This is their home. This belongs to them. And that's the disconnect. They forget that they're part of the family. In both occasions, we need someone like the Father, with his great compassion and lack of care for himself, to run out to us, to meet us where we are. Because that's what the Father does. He meets us exactly where we are. And he shows us that we belong. You guys know this lady? I'm going to credit her because this is the only place I've ever heard it. She always says, whoever you are and wherever you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. That's not just a saying. That's how we want to live. We use this word a lot, community. So it will take, some of you guys are all literally leaving and going, but it will take some of you guys leaving here and going to our brothers and sisters and those outside the door that, for whatever reason, don't think they're invited. We have to remind them who they are. We have to bring back value to them. We have to restore their identity as family. And it will take compassion. And it may take some awkward conversations, maybe difficult conversations. And maybe I'm talking about your personal family. Maybe I'm talking about your church family. Maybe I'm talking about people you know. That's where I'll leave the interpretation up to you. Thank you.